Oh, this is great, but it might take a little unpacking.
Okay.
So first of all, rent-seeking behavior is essentially, it is the derivation of revenue without productivity. In other words, if the iconic example, economists are not going to like this as the iconic example, but the iconic example might be warlords who have control over a road and extract a toll for passing by.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't build the road. What they're doing is just simply extracting revenue without adding anything. The problem, and first of all, I resonate with what you're saying about demonizing people. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons I've chosen to talk about rent-seeking as the problem is that it is not a group of people, right? Now, I do say rent seekers, but mm-hmm. it's a self-defined issue. If I've categorized somebody as rent-seeking, and it turns out that they're actually being productive in some way that I can't see, that's fine. I'm defining the problem as rent-seeking behavior, and the problem is therefore people who engage in rent-seeking, many of whom don't know they're doing it, though. And another thing I've said is that many people are wealthy as a result of productive behavior, but not all of their fortune is the result of that productive behavior. In other words, once you have wealth, that wealth often finds ways to seek rent, and therefore people tend to be hybrids, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the place I disagree with you is in the question of finding it in yourself to avoid this behavior. That may or may not be the right instinct, depending upon what sort of rent-seeking behavior we're talking about. So I would say it exists in anybody who has an investment portfolio. Your money is rent-seeking while you're sleeping. Mm-hmm. Can't help it.
Can I ask a clarifying question here? Because
sure.
What I've set up with the power of the internet is a digital business that essentially makes money if I sleep. We sell access to a course to help people be more confident and charismatic. I've made that course. It exists, and we call it scale in the world of internet. But certainly, I am no longer having to put in value into that asset for it to generate rent for me. So does that qualify as rent-seeking behavior, given that my productivity could stop, but my income would not from that?
That's a really good question, and there's something deep to be sorted there. I can't say in any particular instance, but I can say that there is a point at which you are simply profiting from scale, where you have not introduced something new, mm-hmm. and that this ends up very quickly in rent-seeking behavior, which is exactly why we have laws about monopolies, for mm-hmm. example. The mm-hmm. point at which the monopoly is simply going to profit from all things in the neighborhood is not desirable because it doesn't motivate anybody to generate anything new.
Yes.
So, yes, there is something of that nature, but whether or not you're across the threshold that we should identify as rent-seeking is a different question.
Well, interestingly, amongst my group of friends, it seems like the dream, at least as we're sort of tentatively defining it, is to achieve rent-seeker status, which is to say to have a quantity of wealth such that you would never need to work again, or to have a system of assets that produces for you. So I definitely want to hear more. I see opportunities in my own life to think about this more deeply, and certainly in my friends who have been even more successful. And I have a financier right over here who wants to hop in.
I just have two questions. Is rent-seeking always value destructive? Or can you have rent-seeking behavior that's good for the world? And so, for instance, if I in one day could create something where I distribute it to every person, and every person just takes a pill and it cures them of cancer, heart disease, whatever, but it took me one day of work, but I profit off it every day because every day the whole world sends me a penny in exchange for the pill. Am I rent-seeking? And if so, is that bad, that in one day's work I cured the world's diseases?
So this is a great question. In some sense, what you're asking, given that what we are really talking about is externalities, what you've got is a description of a positive externality that arises without the introduction of new value. Mm-hmm. And what I would say is the reason to identify rent-seeking is not inherently about negatives. What it is a recognition that people are capable of innovating things that are valuable for us, but they are disincentivized from doing so. So yes, we want to get rid of the harms that arise out of rent-seeking behavior. But we also want to incentivize people to be productive in ways that enhance human well-being. And so this really comes down to a diminishing returns problem, where as you get wealthier, you have to do less and less to generate further wealth. That means that all sorts of people, especially people who have demonstrated the capacity to bring value into the world that made them wealthy, are disincentivized from producing new and valuable things, even as they are sometimes incentivized to produce things that are actually harmful. So what we would really like is to leverage the value of markets to drive people to bring as much value into humanity as they can with as little destruction. That's the ideal. And our system is very badly structured from the point of view of doing that, but it could be fixed, not perfectly, but it could be fixed so that, in general, rent-seeking behavior was not rewarded and productivity was rewarded. So
And
really,
question
go
about
ahead.
productivity. So this is one of the difficulties of I grew up on the internet, right? So strangely, one of the most productive things that I can do is make a video and then go to a beach, right? Because that video has a life far beyond the several days that I took to make it. And one of the least productive things I could do would be any sort of one-on-one continuous labor. And so I think, correct me if I'm wrong in saying that, it seems like one area where we agree is that we want a system that incentivizes the production of value. And it doesn't necessarily need to be every day. Like if Ben said, if somebody can cure cancer in a day, like please do that. That can be your contribution to humanity. Such that perhaps it's not just that rent-seeking behavior is bad. It's that any system which places the economy and earning of rents and incomes above doing good in the world is the problem. But there are other rent-seeking behaviors which could coincide with appropriate behavior that we would love to see more of in the economy.
Yeah, this is great. So
Okay.
I used to, I had a little lesson that I taught students in which my point was, you've been told work is good. Work is not good.
That's
Work is the opposite of good.
100%,
Right?
100%.
To the extent that you can bring something of value into the world with less work, please do so. So anyway, we're in 100% agreement. If you can produce value while sitting on a beach, great. That's awesome. We should all seek exactly such things. And hopefully, your sitting on a beach time isn't completely idle either. Hopefully it's, generative in some way. That would be, if all of the work we did didn't feel like work, but was nonetheless productive, that would be a very desirable state of affairs. I do want to go back to something with reference to your last question, because I think it is really the most salient point. It is not necessarily the case that you should seek the rent-seeking in your own behavior and stamp it out. And I know this is counterintuitive, but I did a TED Talk some years ago called The Personal Responsibility Vortex. And it was about the fact that if you decide that you should live your values, you are very likely to hobble yourself with respect to economic and political power such that your values are actually harmed in the process. Whereas if you accept that there is a certain compromise, that the products you buy may not be perfectly green, and although you want to see a sustainable world, if you shop for only sustainable products, you will have much less resource with which to, for example, send your kids to good schools, to persuade your political representatives to do good things. So the question really is one of opportunity cost. Given the effort you have to deploy, what is the way to spend that effort that realizes your values at scale in the most effective way possible? And it probably isn't living your values at home. That said, this is not licensed to be perfectly amoral in your personal life. You have to draw a line somewhere. There are things you won't do, even if they would be remunerative. And there are things you will do, even though you would prefer a world in which they didn't pay.
Got it.
So it's really that kind of question.
Did you have to hop in with something?
Yeah, my only question would be, I would think that most people would describe themselves that way, such that if everyone were evaluating themselves, everyone would say they were a good person. I think in the same way that Hitler would say he was a good person, doing good for the world. And so then there's another world where other people get to judge your behavior to decide if you're a rent seeker who's value destructive, or if you've compromised, but in the end of the day, you're creating value for the world.
Like the CEO of Philip Morris, for instance, who donates a ton of money, but selling cigarettes or something like that.
But that also seems dangerous to externalize that to a jury that gets to decide whether you're living morally or not. And so I'm curious, when you allow people not to live by their values, but to compromise in a way that they think is best for themselves and the world, if that's not actually what everyone's already doing, that's leading to the results that we're potentially being critical of?
Well, first of all, I think empirically speaking, everybody does not believe that they are doing good for the world. I think this is part of the mythology, and people believe it more than they should. But I think if you ask people, you'd get more candor, especially if you ask them in an environment where they're free to be candid without it coming back to haunt them. Some anonymous environment.
Interesting.
But nonetheless, this is again going to be a diminishing returns problem, which is to say we must live by our values. Should you live by your values internal to your family? Yes, you should. Should you live by your values with respect to the products you buy? Almost certainly not perfectly, right? There's going to be some place, and it may be you're living 80% of your values, but you may, like I, believe that pesticides are extremely dangerous to the environment, and they are radically altering it in a way that is extremely destructive. But the cost of organic shampoo is potentially too high, and the added value to the world may be too low in that case. And to the extent that what you really want to do is challenge the use of pesticides, that is much more effectively done at the level of regulation. And it's also the right level to do it. So in some sense, the conversation that we are having ultimately argues for the reinvention of something that used to be called government.
Yeah.
Right? That in effect, government is the manifestation of the values that we agree on being instituted in a fair and equitable way rather than apportioned in some arbitrary way in which the best people pay the highest price. That's really the point about the personal responsibility vortex, is that if you hold people responsible for living their values perfectly, then the people who pay the highest price are the people whose values are the most restrictive. And that means that civilization evolves away from those values because the people who are least encumbered have the most power and influence.
Interesting.
And we don't want that world.
Yeah, I think it's partially because I'm a philosophy major that my government has always been this Kantian ideal that acts in a way such that you could will that everyone would behave in this way. And so even though people won't all buy organic shampoo and put the pesticides out of business, and that's kind of been my model. So this is definitely something for me to think about. Obviously, I've not been perfect at living that model. I would never claim to be.
Well, but imagine for a second that government got serious about simply internalizing the cost of each product so that it was included in the price. If that's all you did, then we would end up with
cheaper organic shampoos.
Yeah, we'd end up with green products. We would end up with pesticides that were less destructive and more effective. All of the things would be properly incentivized. Now, I'm not saying that that's an easy job to do or even plausible, but I am saying if that was the only intervention you could make, suddenly the market would start solving all of the problems that people on the right tend to think it already does.
So at some point, if I'm understanding you correctly, rather than it reflecting going, you know what, I need to reduce my own personal footprint, it might make more sense to donate to a campaign like Unity 2020 that you're interested in, or to redirect that time, effort, and finances into a collective movement, even if it's a small piece of that collective movement.
Precisely. You identify your values and you say, given the resources I bring to bear, what is the most effective way to reach those values? And the effective way is probably not in the supermarket. It's probably something more direct.
Got it. Hope that you guys enjoyed that clip. If you want to see more like this and have us do more podcasts, we are 100% funded by our generous patrons. And if you'd like to contribute, there's a link in the description. Either way, hope that you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.